All right, so this is the Chassidus Forum Shir, and today we're going to be doing the Pri Ha'uretz, which is a cipher of Mendel Vitebsker. He was a Talmud of the Mezritcher Maggid, who was a Talmud of Baal Shem Tov. So it's very high up in the line of Chassidus, as I mentioned in the email. There's going to be an important piece because it deals with an important topic that a lot of us try to reconcile, especially us that are dealing with very deep lamidim. A lot of times you learn very deep things and very complex things. And we find that there's this idea of a mina pshita also. The person has to have just a simple amina, simple faith, kaviyuchel, in Hashem. Of course, we explained that even the mina pshita has a deeper aspect to it. It's not just stam trusting Hashem. It really has to do more with being aware that everything that happens is Hashem. So it actually is a very, very high level. On that level, we're able to sort of dissociate from, the things that bother us and we find uncomfortable because we know that those things really are coming from a higher place, and it's all the toif. So it actually is a relatively hard concept, but a lot of people misunderstand. A lot of people think like that Amina Pshita means that, like I remember one time I was davening with my Siddur Rashash, and somebody who was I don't know what his problem was, but he didn't like it very much, and he told me, "What is this? Put this stuff away. Amina Pshita. You just have to go with simple faith." A lot of people think that it means dafka, don't be smart. Dafka, don't get into complex things and just be simple. It's not actually what it means. And we're going to see here in this piece very beautifully how he's going to sort of bring that out. So I'll just say one thing that I don't actually have the cipher physically. This is one of the things that I'm missing from my library. Baruch Hashem, the library is big, but this cipher is still missing. So I have it on the computer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be reading it from the computer. Which means that it's sort of going to open a different window and I won't necessarily see the chats. I'll keep going back and forth just to make sure that there isn't a chat. If someone asks a question, I can answer it. But if it happens to be that I don't answer right away, you'll know why, because I'm looking at the cipher. Okay, so let's see. Let's get started. So he says, this is one of the pieces in this week's Parsha. He brings down a very interesting Gemara. Amir Razal Chazal say, the Gemara Masechtas Shabbos, Mila be'oisei mukam menayin. Interesting question. How do we know that bris mila means on that part of the body where it is, on the yesod? Interesting question, right? Because the Torah talks about mila, but who says that the definition of mila really means circumcision? Maybe in something else. I think the Gemara there even goes, so he doesn't quote it here. I think the Gemara even has to have maybe it actually means in the heart, because we have psikim that talk about a mila in the heart, right? Which means Alpi Pashtas, not obviously any physical heart surgery, right? It means like we talked about in Menachem, that there's an orla, there's a klippa that covers the person's ego and doesn't allow hashpuas to come in when a person insists on his own individuality and wants to divide himself from everything. Right? So there's this idea of a mila in the heart. So then the Gemara says, how do you know that mila means actually physically on the Mokam HaYesod? Interesting question, but the Gemara, you see, the Gemara like goes through, it really wants to understand. The Gemara says, because it says in the Pusik, Hamoil Lechem Kol Zuchar. It says, you shall do a mila on every male. Right? So what does it mean? What does that mean, do a mila on every male? What is a male different from a female? Well, it's that part of the body that's different. So that's why the Gemara says, Mukam Shei Zuchar, the place where he's a Zuchar, the place that makes him male. That's where you do the Mila. Interesting. He's going to get into this. I'm not sure if we'll finish the whole piece, but we'll try. But he's going to get into the reason for this. And he says, so the way to understand this is, Al Derech HaPusik. There's a Pusik that says, also in our Parsha, right? This Pusik is about the Mila is in our Parsha, and there's also a Pusik in our Parsha, V'hamen ba'Hashem, v'yechesh v'lo tzedakah. It says by Avram that he believed in Hashem, he had a minna in Hashem, and that was considered for him to be a tzedukah. Interesting pusik. What does tzedukah have to do with anything, right? Okay, so he's going to get into it. And he says, "V'al derech Amir Razal," and this goes according to what Chazal say. Gemara Navoid the Zura. It says, "La'olam yisader udam shivcha shel mukam v'achar kach yispal." A person should first praise Hashem and then daven. That is the reason, Kalpi Pashtas, why we have Psikah de Zimra, right? Before we get into davening. right, is because you have to first praise Hashem before you get. In other words, the idea is this is on a simple level. Obviously, on the Kabbalistic level, we have all kinds of Elias Oilamis, Karbunas, and then Psika de Zimra, and then Birchas Krishma, and then Shemona Esrei, right? The four Oilamis. On a push the level, it's that when a person is going to daven, a person can't just jump right into it. He needs to first be aware of what he's doing. And so because of that, the first thing is Shivcha Shel Mukam, praises of Hashem. In other words, the idea is to get into that mood of praising Hashem, which will then be conducive to the tefillah. So he says, Ki hashchina hi hanikras tefillah. We have this idea that the Shechina is called tefillah. And the way to understand this is because we know that the Shechina is Malchus, is Nik, and that is a Makabel, right? And by tefillah, essentially, on the simple level, the idea of tefillah is that we have certain needs, and we want those needs to be fulfilled. So what we do is we daven. So davening, in a certain sense, is the idea of being a Makabel, of receiving sheifa from Hashem. Because of that, the Shechina is called tefillah. And he says like this. And this concept of davening is really the concept of getting into a complete dvaikus, berutzen ha'elyon, with the will of Hashem. Al daihu amina, through amina, bli shem tam, without any reason. So far it does sound sort of like, yeah, don't get into any complicated cheshbonos. It's just pure dvaikus, right? With amina, without any reason. The way to understand this is well, first of all, I'll say, okay, first things first. First off is that we think when we learn Kabbalah, when we learn about Atzilus, we think it's complicated. It's really not so complicated because the Leisham explains to us, and we see this in the Kavunas, that the further down you go in the Oilamis, the more complicated it gets. The Arizal starts Eitz Chaim by talking about the Ein Sof at the very beginning in Shar Aleph, and he says that the Ein Sof is an or pushit. It has no qualities. It's just pure isness, oneness. It doesn't have any attributes. It's the most simple thing you can get. Then after that, when it's the Ein Sof and the empty space, the Mokampuni, then there's only two things in existence: pure being and pure non-being. There is nothing else yet. Then as the Oilamas extend, things become much more complicated. In Atzilus, we're dealing with all sorts of moving parts, right? Really, but really they're limited, right? There's 5 partzifim essentially in Atzilus. Sometimes we split them off into sub-partzifim. They're moving around, and they're growing, and they're shrinking, and they're moving from place to place, being mashpia one to the other, and so on and so forth, all these different things that we see. But really, it's not that complicated. The only reason why it's hard for us is because it's abstract. It's dealing with realities that don't exist here in this world, and we're expected to understand those realities, right? Or try to. So it seems complicated. But if you ask any scientist, if you look at maybe not high school level, because high school level tries to keep it simple. Yes, in the older grades, grade 12. But if you really get into like university level biology, chemistry, and physics, it's far, far, far more complicated than anything that we're learning about in Atzilus. Because the idea is that the lower you go, the more complicated it is, and the higher you go, the more simple it is. So, but even when we're learning about Atzilus, a lot of times what happens is we're so busy with these constructs, what these constructs are doing, that we sort of lose the forest for the trees, so to speak. And we're so busy with these different things that we forget that all of this is actually just a manifestation of that one Ein Sof, right? So the idea is that we have to sort of balance those two things together. We have to be, and he's going to say it later on, Beferish, that we have to, at the same time, and that we're learning these complicated things, we have to remember that there's a real unity and a real achdus behind it. And this is just the way it's manifesting. And that's the idea of being able to always have this amina blishim tam. In other words, a pure amina that's not complicated at all, right? That isn't, he's going to say later on that it's even not necessarily with any emotion, so to speak. A lot of times people fall into a different trap, which is the trap of doing things because they feel good, even spiritual things. So a person really likes davening, and there's nothing wrong with liking it and appreciating that feeling. We're not saying that you can't have that feeling. We're saying that this idea of devaikus transcends all feelings and all emotions and all thoughts. It's something that is or push it. It's simple. So that's the idea. So he says, and he says that all these things are going to be explained by Hashem in this piece. Kimam are going with the Mamar in Kahelis, which says, Kol hanechulim holchem elayam, vayam einayna mulai. Al-mukim she'anechulim holchem, sham hem shuvim leleches. We read this in Kahelis in Sikkus. Basically, it says that all of the rivers flow into the sea, and the sea doesn't get filled. And to the place where the rivers travel, there they will be traveling again. So even on a simple scientific level, it's pretty amazing, actually. The Kahelis is actually talking about the water cycle in a very clear way. He's showing an understanding of the fact that the rivers are flowing into the sea. The sea isn't full. It doesn't say why, but the reason is because, of course, it's evaporating and then it's going back into the rivers, and the rivers are going back into the sea. But there's a lot of deeper ideas in this piece in Kahelis. One of the ideas we have here is this idea that history repeats itself, everything repeats itself, everything is the same, essentially. The rivers are flowing into the sea, then they're going back to their original place. The water evaporates and goes back to its original place, then it flows into the sea again, right? In Gilgilim, this is the way it goes, right? If you really think about it, even though everybody's life has different nuances and different challenges, and people have different personalities, but it's more or less, usually, it's more or less the same story in different halbushes, right? In other words, everyone grows up, everyone experiences certain awakenings, everyone has certain challenges, everyone has good times and bad times, ups and downs, and then eventually it ends. And when it ends, that's like the rivers going into the sea. The neshama goes back to where it came from, goes back to that unity, and then it sort of goes back again in another Gilgul, and it goes through that same process again. So it's the same thing going back over and over and over again. But he's going to say over here in this piece, he's going to say that the idea of the rivers flowing into the sea is the idea that all of the rivers, all these complicated ideas that we have, all these philosophical sometimes and technical sometimes ideas that we have in Pnimius Torah, all of them need to flow into that sea. They need to get to that oneness. That's the point. That's why, like, it's famous that in Chassidus, by the Sfardim, it was like you have to, what's it called? You have to learn when you're learning Kabbalah, right? So, or whatever, or by being mechavan, let's say, right? The Sfardim, by being mechavan, you have to be mechavan the kavunas. Finished. There's no ifs or buts about it. You have to do it. But by the Chassidim, there was this idea that the kavunas are meant to bring a person to Dvaikus. Once a person's already on that place from Dvaikus, he doesn't need the kavunas anymore. That's why this is the real reason why some of the Chassidish Rebbe's didn't daven with the Siddur with kavunas, right? Because they were really on this level that they transcended that already. They're able to get to the top of that Dvaikus right away. It's like the Mor V'Shemesh, when the Chassidus Sfurim says, and a lot of people use it as a weapon against davening with kavunas, but they're misunderstanding it. He says, you don't need to daven with kavunas. All you need to do is be medabek your nefesh to your riach to your neshama to your chaya to your chida to the Ein Sof. That's all you need to do. Nice, right? Well, who knows how to do that, right? If you don't know how to do that, the kavunas are the traditional method in which to access that oneness. But if a person is able to transcend it, then he transcends it, right? The only problem is that these rabbis that weren't davening with kavunas because they were holding on that level of transcending everything. So then their children then, this is the minig. We don't daven with kavunas, but it's silly because it's not about minig. It's about that this person was on a certain level of dvaikas that you maybe are not, perhaps are not on, right? But people misunderstood it because, a lot of times people just like, it's monkey see, monkey do, and the Chassidim see what the Rebbe is doing, so they do the same thing. They don't understand why the Rebbe is doing it. Right, because so this is a very big sigya, and it's rather complicated. We actually had this on. I mentioned this during the shir that we gave about Shmini Atzeres. You find all these complicated kavunas for sikkas, for the naniyim, and for the hakufas by the hashanas, right? You have all these kavunas, but then when it gets to Shmini Atzeres, all it says in Shara Kavunas doesn't say anything about the Rizal being mechav in a certain kavuna. I saw the Siddur Muslik Midvash. Tries to learn in. I'm not arguing with him. Muslim Midvash was a very great person. Daniel Frisch. I'm not going to say that I know more than he does. He was trying to say that the kavunas of the hakufas of the Hishanas should also be the same kavunas for the hakufas of Shmini Atzeres, but it doesn't say that anywhere. And the Mekabulim don't do that. Like the Sephardish Mekabulim for sure, and anybody, the dancing on Simchas Torah is just pure dancing. And I mentioned that the reason for that is this exact reason that we're talking about. That once you've transcended, once you get to that yichud, that dvaikas that Shmini Atzeres represents, then the kavunas are no longer negaya because you've gotten to a higher place. So you can just dance blishim tam without any complicated kavunas. It's just pure dance, pure dvaikas, pure joy, right? So that's basically the idea. So he's going to understand this idea of the rivers flowing into the sea is going to represent this idea of all the complicated druchim and lemidim that we learn. All of it needs to flow into that oneness. Once it gets to that oneness, then over there it's very simple already, right? So he says vehi, and the way this works is ki hashchina laisna magar maklim. The shchina doesn't have anything of its own. Ki im hanimshech, only that which flows to her, aleyu derech hamidus, which flows through the midas. So in other words, the shchina malchus has no light of its own. It's like the moon. And it's only the sunlight that reflects off of that moon and causes it to shine, which means that's only the ashpuz from what he's calling the midas, which means the spheres and zach, right? It's only from that she gets her chiyas. Shehem shivcha shel mukam, and that is the praise of Hashem, as it is known. This is actually a very, very deep idea. The idea of this is kavil. You have to be careful how we say it, but the Rizal says it. It's complicated because the Rizal says like this. The Rizal says at the beginning of Eitz Chaim, he says that kavyuchel, and again, I'm scared to say it, but I'm going to try to say it. The Rizal says that the Ein Sof, why did the Ein Sof make the tzimtzum and make all the oilimus? Kavyuchel, if you can say this, the Ein Sof that isn't ever lacking anything was lacking something, because it was lacking the ability to express itself to an other. It was lacking that kavyuchel, that recognition of an other, of its existence. In other words, imagine if you would be all-powerful, and you could do everything and anything, and you could do all kinds of amazing things, create all kinds of amazing creations and inventions and things, but you lived on an island all by yourself. There'll be nobody there to ever be able to appreciate your work. Kavyuchel. If we can talk this way. Right? So that's the way the Rizal presents it. The Rizal says that Hashem can't be called Elohim. He can't be called God if there isn't those that are not God. And he can't be called a Havaya, existence, if there isn't someone to witness that existence, Kavyuchel. Like the old parable about the tree falling in the forest, right? Can anyone hear it? If no one hears it, doesn't make a sound. Right? If there's no makabel, what's the point of a mashpia? Right? So kavyuchel, that aspect the Rizal says was missing. People don't like that. A lot of people, no one will argue on the Rizal beferish. A lot of people try to sort of take it in a different direction. Like the Ramchal sort of said that that Lamaso, it was just because the Ein Sof's derech is to be mashpia, because the Ein Sof wants to be maitiv, he wants to do good. And so because of that, he needed to have someone to do good too. People yelled at the Ramchal for changing the Rizal's pshat. The Ramchal tried to soften it a little bit, but ultimately he's saying the exact same thing. Because he's also saying, if you're saying that the Ein Sof's roots is to be maitiv, and that's why he needs to be someone to be maitiv to, they're also saying essentially the Ein Sof is kavyuchel, in a certain sense lacking something. So the idea is that the midas kavyuchel of Hashem, the spheres of Atzilus, which are being mashpia into Malchus, they're called the shivcha shaluk, and they're called the praise of Hashem. Because kavyuchel, in a certain sense, you can say that that if Hashem doesn't have attributes, if it's just the Ein Sof in its Ein Sofness, then there's not really anything you can say about it. So there's no praise of it. When you have the spheres and the midas, right? Hold on. Okay, everyone's muted. If you have the spheres and the midas there, so then there's qualities you can start praising. You can't praise something that doesn't have qualities, right? So because of that, that is called shivcha shel mukam, is the midas that are mashpia into nik. And this is a Zohar Kudish in Chalek Bais. It says v'lechain, therefore, k'she'udam chufetz l'davka bo yisburach. If a person wants to be dovik to Hashem, and that's not all people necessarily have that as a goal, unfortunately, but we do. That's why we're learning this. That's why we come to these shirim, right? So those that want, if someone really wants to be dovik to Hashem, it's not possible. Ki im al dai tefillah. It's only possible through tefillah. right? Shia Shchina, which is that idea of the Shchina. And this is like so amazing what he's saying here. Because like I pointed this out in the Likutei Moharan Shir, I pointed out this idea. Like I said, the Shirim always flow into each other. In the Likutei Moharan Shir this week, I pointed out that Rabbi Nachman essentially is saying that person needs to get to the level of Dvaikis, where he's one with Hashem, meaning there's no other, it's just oneness, but he should daven to Hashem to get there. Well, that's very funny because davening is the opposite of kivyuchol, if you can say this. The davening is the opposite of oneness, because davening is basically saying that there's two entities here. There's a person, there's Hashem that he's davening to. So it's not oneness, it's duality, right? So how can Rabbi Nachman say that that's the way to get to oneness? This is exactly what he's saying here too. Right? He's saying a person wants dvaikis, he wants oneness. It's only possible through tefillah. But the idea is that it needs to be step by step. Because we're not living in a world of duality, we're living in a world of multiplicity. We have all kinds of things going on all over the place, right? We have appointments, we have jobs, we have family members, we have phone calls to make and phone calls to answer, and we have tons of things that are going on all over the place. Something that's overwhelming how much is going on, right? So the idea is tefillah dissipates everything so that there's only two. There's only the person and Hashem. That's a great step up from the duplicity that we live in constantly in our regular lives. And it's sort of like the Sanzeruv, right? I always tell this story. The Sanzeruv was there was once he was a very big good, very big Talmid Chacham. So a lot of times he would deal with other Talmid Chachamim, a lot of whom were misnagdim. And one of these people once was telling the Sanzeruv over a chiddush that he had, and he said, the Sanzeruv asked him, "When did you have that chiddush?" And he said, "Oh, it came to me in the middle of Shemona Esrei." The Sanzeruv told him, and he didn't mean to be a Baal Gava, he meant to point out a very important point. He said, "Well, when I daven Shemona Esrei, I don't remember that the Torah exists." Right? In other words, the idea is that from the multiplicity becomes only two. And that's very, very simple. Of course, you can say, and you would be right, that so then maybe it's better to daven simply than to daven with all the kavunas, because that's much more multiplicity, much more things going on and whatever. But the idea is that to say that I'm davening in such a way that all that exists is me and Hashem, most people are not holding on that level, right? It's the goal. It's the goal to get to that type of tefillah. And indeed, like I said, al pi Chassidus, once a person gets to that level where nothing exists by tefillah except him and Hashem, he doesn't need to be mechavan the kavunas, right? But since when we daven, it's not like that. When we daven, we have thousands of thoughts going on in our minds. We're getting distracted by the person beside us who's davening too loud, or who's moving a chair, or whatever's happening around us, and we're thinking about every single thing that we still have to do that day, and things are going on. Our minds are buzzing, and we can barely mechavan in the words. So then we're not holding on that level of there just being two. If we're not holding there, the idea of the kavunas is to help our concentration, instead of being on all the outside things, our concentration should be on what's happening in the tzilas while I say the words of this tefillah. That's a step up from thinking about who I have to call back after Mariv and what my wife's making for supper, right? It's a big step up to only be thinking about what's happening in tzilas when I say Burich, what's happening in tzilas when I say Atu, what's happening in tzilas when I say Hashem, right? So the kavunas are a step up. But a step up from the kavunas to get to this level of such pashtus that's just the person in Hashem. Then from there, it moves on to the next level, which is total yichud, total connection. So he's sort of outlining the steps, how you get to that total yichud. So he says that to get to dvaikas, you have to go through tefillah, shehi shchina, which is the shchina. And remember, the shchina is a mekabel, right? The shchina is a mekabel. The shchina is a pure vessel. It's pure receiving. So the goal of tefillah is to be a vessel to receive those bruchas, and that's a minna, really, be'emes. And it's the opposite of what most people do by tefillah. Most people by tefillah, what they're busy with is davening for all the things that they think they need. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but the ultimate level, but like I mentioned many times by the shirim, that's not really being a makabel. Because you're trying to insist that things have to be a certain way. If you insist that things have to be a certain way, you're not being a makabel. You're insisting that your will has to be done, right? So part of tefillah is what, as we're davening for everything, to also be able to let go and say, Hashem, I trust you. I have a minna. I have betuchen. I trust that everything that you do is exactly what is meant to happen, and sort of just let go. At the same, it's paradox. At the same that you're davening, you're also letting go, right? And it's all about that experience of that dvaikus, as the Rizal explains to us. The Shema Esrei is a zivik, essentially, right? Which is not as much a petition for things that I need as it is intimacy, right? Oneness between two parties, kavyuchol. So that's the real idea of tefillah. It says shehiha yira, and that's the idea of yira, because the Shekhinah is connected to yira, to fear, right? Fear or awe. Better to use the word awe, right? Because it's not the negative type of fear. The Shekhinah is called yira. Yira Shemayim is connected to malchus. The idea of yira on the deepest level, like the true yira, awe, is to be totally overwhelmed by the greatness of Hashem. Totally be like, whoa, right? In awe of the greatness of Hashem. And sometimes you can do this just through machshava, through thinking. Like it's possible for a person to just start thinking about all the things in his life and to think about how one little tiny change in things that he did in the past would make a whole different type of an outcome. And nothing else could create this reality that he's in now, except that things happen exactly the way that they happened. In other words, sometimes you can realize sometimes it's very big things. Like if you think about it, the fact that you have the kids that you have is because you're intimate with your wife at those particular times when those particular that particular sperm cell, that particular egg cell were available there. If that wouldn't have happened, and the wife would have been fertilized a month later, right? Then it would have been totally a different child, with a different personality, with a different story, with a different life. So one little tiny thing like that transforms the world. Or a decision, right? My decision to move to Toronto. If I would have stayed in Borough Park, I don't think this year would have been going on. I have no idea. I don't know what would have happened. The world would have been completely different. I wouldn't have known any of you people, right? Right? Because everyone here I know basically just from Toronto. I can't even imagine, right? So sometimes just thinking can bring a person to this awe. But the goal is that in tefillah, when you have this idea of kavyuchol, you're standing before infinity. You're standing before all of existence, kavyuchol, and the source of all of existence, and you're connecting to that. That's like, whoa, that's yira. Because bezois yuval kodesh. That's the way to get to dvaikus. Aval midles lama garma klim. But since Nick doesn't have anything of her own, and we want to get into tefillah, which is Nick, to that level of being a makabel. So then tzurich tchilas, and the first thing I have to do is the sada shefcha shel mukim. Like the Gemara said, first you have to do the praises, the psikah de zimra. That's what you have to start with. Why? Because you want to fill up Nick from the midas, from Zah, right? So the idea is first you're sada shefcha shel mukim canal, bekadai leoira leyu. In order to shine down into the Shekhinah, that Hashpur that's coming from Zah. Shekhinah Meiris, then the Shekhinah says, quote from the Zohar, Chazi b'mai bru asina lekamach. I'm not sure I didn't look up the Zohar. I'm not sure the context, but it's like the Shekhinah saying, look, with what my son is coming here. So I guess the idea is that the Shekhinah is like sort of like in awe of, or kavyuchol, or impressed with, or whatever it is. I don't understand exactly the idea, but I'm impressed with the fact that we're coming to this level of being mashpia to the Shekhinah and filling up the Shekhinah, which is what's happening when we connect the Psikah Zimra into the davening. And it says Kushamegia dvaikus, and once the person gets to dvaikus, Yuvan as Zois b'menusai, he understands all of this, but how does he understand it? Not with his mind, he understands with his amina, with that pashtus. Kedain loy hisig, loy tam loy rayach. And this could happen even to a person who doesn't have any hasugas of elikis. Right. In other words, the idea is that you don't. It's not a prerequisite to know Kabbalah to have an experience of Dvaikus. Like in Chassidus, the Baal Shem Tov told all these stories about very, very simple people who are on high levels of Dvaikus. So it's possible to get there even without that. But the idea is that a person needs to be able to have that emina, even after all of the investigations and the thinking and the concepts that he was able to be masik, to understand, to absorb. So he's going to say soon that that's an even higher level, because when a person doesn't know anything, he has a mina pshita. Well, that's pretty obvious because he doesn't know anything. He doesn't have anything to work with. So that such a person can just have mina by itself. But the really big level is when someone's able to understand deep things. At the same time, he understands the deep things, also have that emina. Shekol has the gois of einam yecholim bo yizbura. But lamasa, because the person has to be aware, even after learning the entire Eitz Chaim, the entire Rashash, knowing all the kavuns, understanding everything, he thinks, right? But that everything he understands is just a drop in the ocean, or one grain of sand on the seashore of the true complexity and the true reality of all the truths of all the universes, right? This is just one little tiny fragment, even though it's the key because it's the basic structure that's going to answer up all the fragments. Everything's going to fit into that structure. But Lamasa, it's only one little piece, because that person has to sort of humble himself and not think I'm so much greater than everyone else because I understand more deeper things than other people understand. The person has to be aware that if we're dealing with Ein Sof, then you can never be masig Ein Sof. You can never understand something that is, even the concept of infinity itself. We talk about it, we can put it into a calculation, into an equation. They do that in mathematics, right? Even a line with two arrows on both sides, that's a line that goes infinitely outward in both directions, right? If it has an arrow on one side, that means it goes infinitely outward in that particular direction. But what does that even mean? We don't understand what that means because our minds can't grasp the idea of infinity. So we just imagine it going further and further and further and further out into space and whatever, but what does it mean infinity, right? We have no idea. So that's something that we sort of have to remind ourselves of, that we shouldn't start thinking we're so great and so amazing. It is amazing that a person is able to, in this day and age, devote his time to holy things as opposed to just being busy with, the world and all of its distractions and making money and whatever else. It is impressive, and we can, in a certain sense, pat ourselves on the back that we're trying really hard. But at the same time, we have to be aware that whatever we have learned is only a drop in the bucket of everything that is really there. He says, "Avokol ha'asagois of einam rak pe'ilas his chaskas of minim," and a person has to understand that anything, if he really wants to understand pnimis of Torah, so it's important to be mechazik the amina at the same time, because as we know, as it says in Sfurim, as Chaim Vital says, and everyone says, even though Kabbalah, as we can see from the more technical shirim, is a science more than anything else, it's the aspect of Torah that's most similar to science. Because everything else in Torah, is different, halachas and whatever. But here we're dealing with structures of and constructs in worlds. So it's very scientific in a certain sense. But if a person learns it as he sits down to learn biology, sits down to learn Eitz Chaim, it's a mistake, right? He's not going to get anywhere. He's not going to understand. Hashem's not going to let him understand anything, right? If he's trying to do that. You have like these people, I don't want to say any names, but there's certain professors or whatever that write on Kabbalah rather extensively, or wrote, and who perhaps had an extensive breadth of knowledge. They could tell you the whole history of Kabbalah in their particular interpretation of it, right? Because they don't agree with us on everything, like the authorship of the Zohar and so on and so forth, but whatever. But then when it gets to like explain to me the Rizal system, and you look in the, you shouldn't look, but if someone happens to look, in the works of these I don't even know what you call them, Jewish religion researchers, whatever, however you call it, and the people that are, that's like their professor, their degrees in that, right? And then none of them can explain the result system except in a very, very basic and babyish way, missing all the depth and missing all the key points. I've in my lifetime, I've looked at some of these things and I've seen, right? Because it doesn't open up unless you're doing it for the right reasons. It only opens up if you're doing it because you want to connect to Hashem, and that's your intention. That's why he says that everything the person wants to be masik in Pnimis Torah all comes from his chaskes or minna. That at the same time working on the minna, working on reminding ourselves that despite we're laying all these deep things, but the Ein Sof is push it. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't make things too complicated, right? Or if you do make them complicated, remember that that's just the chitzoni, is just the outer layer of it, and the inner layer of it is simple, right? That's why, like, you have the story that I say over a lot of times. I haven't said over in a while, but you have the story from the Torah Chacham, Talmud of the Rashash, who when he was giving, so obviously someone who really understood on a very, very deep level, and he was learning Eitz Chaim with a Chabira, and someone came in a little bit late, and he asked, "What daf are we holding on?" And he told them, "What difference does it make?" Because ultimately, it's all the same thing. Every page of Eitz Chaim, every line is saying exactly the same thing, just in a slightly different way. And it's just teaching you that the same thing is true on all levels. So we talk about Yidkai Vuvkai. We talk about the four Oilamas. We talk about the Yidkai Vuvkai is connected Abav Iman Za'anik. We talk about Naranchi, Nefesh Shemachai Yechida. We talk about all these concepts. We talk about the four elements. And we talk about all these things that are parallel to Havaya, all the things that in the Erechin charts, that we have on the Google Drive for those that want to see them. It just goes to show you that everything is exactly the same. It's all the same. It's all push it. It's just that everything has different nuances, which manifest eventually as complexity, right? But ultimately, it's all pashtus. So because of that, we have to keep reminding ourselves that the deeper that we delve into this, that we shouldn't think that this is all there is. Really, on the deepest level, it's also simple, and that's the idea. He says, "V'choizek hamina magdal manhir mazhir siddur shivchoy Hashem yizburach yoser." And then the idea of that amina is going to then allow him to praise Hashem better, because we say we praise Hashem to get to tefillah, which is amina. And then once we get to that amina, we get to that level of connection, that dvaikus, then we're able to praise Hashem better too. Right? Sharai Lesla Magram Aklim, because really Nick has nothing of her own, and she only has that which is mashpia to her through the Shivchai Amukam, which is the spheres above. But ultimately, once she gets that ashpua, now she's full, right? And now she can be mashpia. Okay, and then he goes on, like I'm going to start summarizing a little bit because I want to get to the key points. But he goes on then, and he goes on to the idea of what's it called, that it's sort of like a loop. The more you praise Hashem, the more you get to Dvaikas. The more you have Dvaikas, the more you can praise Hashem. It sort of goes back and forth together. And he says, but ultimately, so that's why that idea of a minute is so essential. Okay, so then he says, this is the really important part. He has a few like a paragraph down. He says, now he says the Medrash tells us, what's the difference between Noach and Avram? We know that Noach was praised as a tzaddik. At the same time, we see sometimes Noach wasn't such a super tzaddik, because we see like Noach, Chazal criticize him for having, it says over there that he was waiting for the rain to come for the mabul, right? And so it looks like he was mekatnei amina. Looks like he was lacking in the minna. But we just said that Noach is tzaddik, right? So how could Chazal be so critical of Noach? Okay, so I mean, on a certain level, we can understand that even a person that has a minna sometimes has challenges. Sometimes that a minna, it isn't always as strong. We see in Chazal a general sense of needing to sort of slightly minimize Noach and maximize Avram, even to the extent of talking about like even on Noach is tzaddik, he tumim he b'deraisa, right? Noach was a tzaddik and he was tumim, he was perfect in his generations. Then on that, the Chazal say, there's two ways. One way is l'shvach, one way is l'ganai. In his generation, he was a tzaddik. If he would have been in the generation of Avram, he would have been nothing. right? That's the Gnai. That's one of the approaches that Chazal take. What's this idea? What's Avram better than Noach? So he brings over here a very, very Nogaya Medrash in Brash's Rabbah, who explains it. Where he says, the difference between Noach and Avram is he al pi mushal. He says the Medrash says a mushal for the difference. He says Noach Noach was similar to a friend of the king. So this is a mushal that we're going into. He was like a friend of the king who sat in darkness. He didn't have electricity in his house, whatever. He didn't have lamps, whatever. The king saw that he doesn't have light. The king came, and he shined a light for him. Okay, so that's one level. In other words, Noach was connected to Hashem. He had a dvaikus to Hashem, but it was almost like the way the Medrash sounds like it's stating it is like Noach was like sort of like a Rachmanis case. He was like, he was like someone who was sitting in darkness, I guess in the darkness of his generation and what was going on around. And then so Hashem sort of said, okay, I'm going to take this person out of darkness because I love him, because he's a good guy, he's a tzaddik, right? So Hashem says, I'm going to take him out of the darkness. Okay, that's Noach. But the Medrash says further, Avram is different. Avram is doimel le'oyev shabu l'hayir le'melech. But Avram is different. Avram is like someone a friend of the king, who came to shine for the king. In other words, I guess the king was having a problem with darkness, and he came to shine. V'omar HaMelech, and the king said, Ad sha'atu mayer ba'fayla, since you're shining in the darkness on your own, without me having to shine for you, you're shining yourself, unlike the first person, then go and shine in a place of light. Ein sham, halushin tzach. Okay, that's the medrash. On a push level, if you don't want to get into, he's going to say a little bit deeper. On a push level, he would just say that the chilek is probably like the Zohar says, right? Noach wasn't shining in the darkness because, like the Zohar Kodesh says, it criticizes Noach for not having tried to save others enough. And I know in this itself, there's a contradiction in the Medrash. Some places say he did, some places say he didn't. But the Zohar's approach is that he didn't do anything for others. In other words, Hashem said, build a boat. Okay, I'm building a boat. I want to save my family, but he wasn't trying to go around and tell people to do tshuva and that the Mabel's coming. And that's the way the Zohar says it. So he wasn't shining in the darkness. He was expecting Hashem just to shine for him, and Hashem did, because Hashem loved him, because he had a special relationship. But it wasn't like Avram. Avram was also in darkness. He was also the generation of idolatry, of a totally misguided perception of the world and what the world is. No awareness at all of the Ein Sof, no awareness of the oneness of reality, dividing everything, which is what Avodah Zarah is, making like that the sun is an independent entity and that it has its own power, and the moon is a different independent entity that has its own power, and every single household idol has its own attributes, and it was like everything was separation. Avram was coming, was saying, no, it's all one. He was coming, he was shining in the darkness. Because he was shining in the darkness, Hashem said, oh, I didn't have to shine for you. You're shining on your own. So that's an even higher level. That's the Parshas in the Medrash. But he explains like this. He explains like this. The Indian is Ki Noach hayat tzaddik be'menusai b'lishav hasuga. Noach was a tzaddik, and he had the minna, but he didn't have any asuga iyinus. He didn't think into things in a deep way. He didn't learn Kabbalah, right? If you can say those words. He didn't think into things in a deep way. His minna was just very simple. And he was very good. He was a very good person because of the minna that he had, and his actions were very good. And Hashem shined to him. But Avram, when he was 3 years old, he already was thinking about Hashem. And he recognized that there must be something higher than all these idols. Says Al-Pi, because he investigated. That's why the Medrash presents it, like an investigation. It's not that Hashem suddenly said, Lech Lecha, come, let's go. It didn't just appear out of nowhere. Avram took that first step. He put the ball in Hashem's court, so to speak, because he was investigating for himself, and he was doing He was thinking into things. It doesn't mean Ian like in Gemara, it means Ian into existence and to nature of existence and the purpose of life. All these things that we talk about in these really deep shirim, right? That's what Avram was doing. It probably much deeper than we're doing. His boinenness, and he was thinking and contemplating, right? And he was growing and growing in his understanding and in his awareness. And despite the fact that he was thinking so much and comprehending so many deep ideas, that didn't make him, in Yiddish they have this word "aufgeklärt," right? About someone who's like, I don't even know what's the exact translation, but like someone who's too smart, which means in a certain sense too open-minded. In a lot of people, when they start getting deeper into this is why like philosophy was something that some of the Chassidus Rebbes weren't so into, was because sometimes what happened was the person started thinking so deeply into things, and sometimes he went in a heretical direction, and then he started like he thought, I'm so smart, I figured everything out, so I know better. He started to think, he started becoming a Balgavan. He started thinking, I know better than the Chazal because they were primitive people who lived 2,000 years ago, and I'm living in this age of intelligence, and I'm so intelligent myself, I figured everything out. And then these people started abandoning Amina. Sometimes too much knowledge can be hard, right? Marbe das marbe machlev, right? I think that's the Lushan in Mishle, I think, right? The more you know, the more pain you have. It's funny, right? But the more you overthink things and things get very complicated, and then things become painful. So in a certain sense, the fact that Avram was able to have a mina pshita, even though he was such a deep thinker and he thought so deeply, that is a much higher level than Noach, rather than mina pshita without thinking about things. Okay, so much at least as Avram. So even though he had all this cycle, but he was still tumim afterwards. Shiha mina levad, which is that pure mina. Right? It says, and that's what it says, Kamama, and that's like what the Pusuk says, his halach lefunai. Right? Hashem said to him, walk before me. Shilamalim in the midas, which is lefunai before the midas, because the one that's talking is Zah. It's always Zah that's talking in the Torah. Right? Kavyuchel. Hashem, the Ein Sof manifesting through Zah. Zah is saying, Kavyuchel, his halach lefunai, walk before me. Walk before me. Before me really means higher than me. Right before me, like if someone's walking, there are people walking a line. The one walking before the other person means that he has transcended that. So Kavichu Zah says to Avram, go past me. Lamalim in the midas, go past the midas, past all the complication, into the place of oneness. And be tumim, be perfect, be in a sense simple, in a sense, right? Get from that complexity into the simplicity that's lying behind it. He says, because if a person wants to understand Hashem, it's impossible because there's no end, because Ein Sof means infinity. To understand infinity, you have to get to infinity, you have to understand an infinite number of things. That's impossible. Right? This Kashas Vadvaikas Amiti, and the true connection to Hashem, the true Dvaikas, is Boyz Burach Yal Dayamina Zilevad. It's really that a person, after all of the investigating and the thinking and the contemplating and being aware of new ideas and new concepts, new realities, the person's still able to be on that level of realizing and being aware, not just saying it or thinking it, but really being aware on a deep level, deep down inside. There's really a simplicity behind everything. And so he says, okay. So then he says, but Lamasa, it's not so bad if a person just has a minute without all the complexity, all the thinking, and all the contemplating. Because he says that Lamasa, a father has nachas riach, he gets nachas from his son, if his little son, his little baby, I guess, recognizes it's his father, even before the child has any intelligence, right? In other words, once that little baby starts saying tati, tati, or abba, abba, right? The father just is so geschmack and his heart melts, and he has such nachas from that, right? Why? the child is holding on a very primitive level at this point. At this point, according to the scientists, a small child from 1 year old, could be certain animals have more intelligence at that point than the child has. And they say some animals, I don't remember which kinds, but I read recently, some kind of an animal has roughly the intelligence of like a 4-year-old child, right? So what's I don't know how they measure these things, so I don't know how accurate it is. Take it with a grain of salt. But Al Capunim, but I'm trying to bring out that child's not some big genius. He just recognized that this is his father, and that's already pretty impressive. And the father is Nachal Zriach. He says, even if a person doesn't know any Kabbalah, doesn't know anything technical, all he knows is Hashem is his father, and I'm davening to him, that's also chushiv. But again, that's like noyach, right? Because ultimately the other level is higher. Then a person starts investigating and going into things really deeply and seeing how everything goes back to that oneness and still staying connected to the oneness and not becoming a Balgava because he's getting so deep into things, right? Which is what the Samach Mem right away wants to get us to do, is to start getting all pumped up. So that's what he says. And then he says, just summarizing a little bit. I wish we could really go through every word, but it's just like we're almost out of time. Okay. Second. So then he says very interestingly like this. He says a little bit later on, he goes to a few side points. Then he says a very interesting idea. He says that he goes to the difference between the Ein Sof itself and the Oilimus that we learn about in Pnimis Torah. He says all these Oilimus are created, right? Kol Island Nevrui Be'oifen V'Seider. They're all created in a specific way. They function a specific way. They're almost mechanical, the Partzifim, right? Even though we sort of give them attributes that are organic, because we call them names like Abba, Ima, right? And we give them functions that are sort of organic. It's almost like a family in a certain sense. But the way they're talked about is very technical. There's moving parts, and these parts are going around and growing and shrinking and moving and shining into others and being makabel from others. All kinds of stuff is going on there. But they were created with a certain teva, he says. The teva habriya, he is kashrezeh. But the idea is we have to remember that behind that teva, behind that nature, and the same thing will be of this world too. This world it could be very, very dry. If you take a microscope and you start looking at a person, you start seeing first of all the cells, and then all the amino acids and complex chains of different nucleotides and whatever else there is inside the cells, right? It becomes very, very complex and almost becomes like a machine too. What happened to the person? You lost the forest for the trees, right? Because you got so into the complexity that you forgot that this is a person. You're looking at these technical little pieces that are combining in the cell. And if you go even further into what they're made up of course, they're made up of molecules and atoms, which are, you can keep going and going and going, and it gets so complicated, and you forget that you're looking at a person, right? So he says that all these complexity of the oilimus, lamasa, it's all, you have to be aware that it's all coming from Hashem. He says that Mashankain, he is Burach, Ilas Kol Ilas, that Hashem himself, the Ein Sof, is the cause of all causes. Ein Sof Burachi, Habore Esakol, the creator of everything. Megam Teva Habriya Hanal, Ein Shaykh Boy Shim Tanig, this Kashas Anal Klal, Shai Hiburav Hateva, and Mekai Moisa, Bechol Rega. Because he says that Kavyuchal Hashem is constantly being Mekayim that Teva, because we forget this, right? And in science certainly they don't look at it this way. They look at the world as something that's sort of that's sort of like moving along on its own. They said some of these, the atheists, scientists will even say that without a creator, it's just moving on its own from some random thing that caused it to start, and it's just going by itself, and nature's sort of going on, and the ecosystems are sustaining themselves, and so on and so forth. Things are evolving, and everything that they say, right? But our way of looking at it is different, because even though it seems to be going like that, but lamas, you can't forget that behind it there's Hashem Kavyuchel, who's being the Ein Sof, which is being Mekayim that whole existence every second. Kibilti chufetz kiyima chol rega b'rtzoynei zburach ki'ili loy ha'yisov ma'ila b'tayla. Because if Kaviyuchal Hashem for 1 second would say, okay, I don't want this, it would all disappear, as if it never existed. Then Bekitzer, he says, so we have to be aware that the Ein Sof is always behind all the complexity, and the Ein Sof itself is simplicity. And he says that Kaviyuchal, what's it called? That Hashem Kaviyuchal, he goes into the whole idea of the tanig and the enjoyment that Hashem has from the world, and so on and so forth. But Bekitzer, we can't even understand that tanig that Hashem has, because it's nothing like anything that we've experienced in this world. Then he goes into the side point. We're not going to go into it because we don't have time. But he goes into the side point where he brings that from the Rambam. The Rambam was a philosopher, right? So the Rambam says that a reason for the mitzvah of Mila is lahatish koyach ha-mis'ave, in order to weaken the tava that a person has. And push what the Rambam is talking about is that if a person isn't circumcised, he has that orla covering that top part, which is very sensitive of that Mukum Bris. So then he's going to apparently experience much more powerful feelings of pleasure during intimacy. And so the Rambam says the reason for Mila is so that part of the body becomes desensitized, and so it doesn't feel as good. That's the Rambam. And obviously there's an issue with this, because we didn't like, and by Chassidim for sure, we didn't like all these kinds of rational sort of explanations for the mitzvahs, because when you do that, you get into all kinds of trouble, right? Because if the mitzvahs are only to serve certain purposes in this world, so as soon as that purpose is not relevant for a person, let's say a person will say, well, I'm not planning to get married, so I don't have to have a bris milah, right? It could lead to problems. So we didn't like this. And he talks himself very sharply on the Rambam. He says, Va'emes kizal hoitzi mipiv kudosh, he emitted from his holy mouth, so he's talking with respect, dvurim amitiyim, true words, mi'udem, and things that are established, b'remeshel oilam, and very high things, even though he didn't mean it. In other words, he's saying that the Rambam's push-up shot is something that we can't accept. But that's the reason for bris milah. But what he's saying with this on a deeper level is the idea that we're talking about, and he gets into the idea that the whole idea of the bris milah, because that's really where we started with. This is sort of tying back to the beginning of the Torah. The idea of the bris milah is this idea of this dvaikus to Hashem, right? Because it represents the idea of it's on the Mukum Bris, which is the idea of dvaikus, of zivik, right? So the idea is when a person is on that level of dvaikus, then he gets a level of mina pshita, and he doesn't need any tavas, and he doesn't need tavas anymore. He doesn't need to do the mitzvahs because they feel good. He's transcended that, and he does them because he's on dvaikus. And that's really the deeper interpretation that the Rambam didn't even mean, but his words really mean, is that the bris milah, dvaikus, it makes a person no longer need to do things for side reasons, like they have enjoyment from them, from doing the mitzvahs, and because that's more or less what he says over time. Okay, so we'll stop over here, Bez Hashem, and next week, Bez Hashem, Shirim should be on regular schedule. So have a wonderful Shabbos, everyone, and shkoich for logging in, for participating. It's always good to see everyone. Bez Hashem, we'll see you next year. Well, Tov and good Shabbos.